Enemy stacks are arrangements of enemies where you place them one on top of each other and they snap to this one individual object. Today I'll be giving a guide on enemy stacking so that you can know how to exploit enemy stacks to put enemies into position and control their movement in interesting and unique ways that can add a lot of value to your levels. The way an enemy stack moves is based on the enemy at the very bottom of the stack. So if the enemy at the bottom changes, the movement properties of the stack will also change. You can exploit this feature in all sorts of creative ways by breaking the stack or shearing off parts of the stack at different points in time to create movement of enemies in unique ways that you wouldn't normally be able to make in Mario Maker. Before we talk too much about enemy stacks, first you need to know a little bit about what sorts of enemies can make stacks. So in some situations, enemies that will normally make a stack, like boos, cannons, and piranha plants, will not be able to form a stack because they cling to a wall. Some enemies will lose the ability to stack in certain themes. So in underwater themes, where Goombrats, for example, swim around, they are unable to form stacks. Additionally, parachuting enemies cannot form stacks. So for example, here, if I want this Muncher to crush this bomb very quickly, this is going to form a stack, and that might not be what I want. However, if I have a bomb on a parachute, it can no longer form a stack, and a Muncher right above it will immediately explode the bomb. This technique is useful in a wide variety of situations, such as here, when you can quickly make chain chomp stumps. Now we've talked about how to make and break stacks in the editor, let's talk about how stacks can change while the game is running. So the most common way to make or break a stack is to shear off an enemy. So the enemy on the bottom of the stack will engage in its normal movement without any sort of concern about what enemies are in the stack above it. Here, for example, when that Goomba walks into that set of ground tiles, that shears off this top three set of Goombas in the stack, and they continue on their own way while still in their own separate stack. Furthermore, enemies in stacks can be sheared off by ground from below. So for example, here I have a dry bones that is indeed stacked on this Muncher. However, because there is ground tiles near it, it immediately breaks the stack. The enemies in the middle of the stack will also generally not care about semi-solid platforms or related. They'll only care about solids that really strongly push them around. When an enemy in the middle of a stack gets killed, usually the entire stack will try to collapse to stay connected as one piece. So here you can see that even though I killed the Goombrat in the middle, the Goombrats on top still try to connect to the stacked Goombrat on the very bottom. Additionally, if I use some fireballs, the stack still tries to keep its structure. Some enemies, when they take damage, will be able to stay as part of the stack. So here, for example, this Paragoomba can take damage and keep the Spinies stacked on top. However, when it's in the middle of the stack, then it completely breaks free. And when it's not winged, then the dissolution of the giant Goomba makes it break apart no matter what. With the exception of Boom Boom, most bosses stay a part of their stack if they're at the bottom of the stack. However, many bosses, if they're in the middle, they'll still completely break free. The same thing does not happen if you sever the stack in a more physical way. So for example, here I'm going to crush the Goombrat in the middle with some dotted line blocks. And you can see that as opposed to killing it with a fireball, now the stack does split into two halves. And if I were to go through the door, the Goombrats in the middle of the stack are going to be spawn blocked, and that is going to start out the entire stack spawned in as though the Goombrat in the middle was never placed, as two separate stacks. Stacks also wiggle, especially when the enemy at the bottom moves around. So here, for example, this Goombrat walks back and forth, and you can see that the stack doesn't stay straight, especially when it gets very tall. It's a lot more pronounced. And you can effectively shake them off just by jostling them around too much. This applies to sideways springs as well, which will also disrupt stacks by moving one item in the stack really far away from the others. So here, for example, that Goomba stack doesn't just split into two halves. The top part of it just completely breaks apart. The Goomba stack that has a boo stack on top, which is normally pretty stable, this Goomba breaks off so fast that the two boos in the stack still stay together. Stacks also have a unique interaction with POWs, where if a POW block explodes, only the very bottom enemy in the stack will die. However, a POW thrown at a stack will kill one enemy from making contact with the POW to the stack, and then one from the additional shockwave. And so, enemy stacks are the best way to make sure that Mario throws a POW directly at a target. Keep in mind that anything that disrupts the stack will make them count separately. Some items at the bottom of a stack, such as a cannon, blaster, or chain chomp stump, will make the entire stack immune to the effects of a POW block, unless thrown directly at it. Next, I'd like to go over the loading properties of stacks. In general, if any one part of the stack loads in, then the entire stack will load in. So here we can see that these munchers on music blocks each makes a note. So in theory, when I load into this horizontally, this muncher would load at the same time as that muncher under normal circumstances. However, since this small muncher is in a stack with this large boo, and this boo's hitbox, because it is offset, it is right in between those two tiles, this muncher should load in a little bit earlier than this muncher. We can put this together and hear what sounds it makes. Now, here we heard those three distinct notes being played, which means that yes, this muncher indeed was played sometime in between. This also works in vertical worlds. So here I have this muncher that should be playing this note, and it's connected to this Bill Blaster stacked with that Bill Blaster, stacked with the other Bill Blaster, stacked with that Bill Blaster. So in theory, this muncher would never normally load in from so far away in a vertical world. But here, since this Bill Blaster is in its proper loading range, the entire stack is loaded in simultaneously, and we can hear that sound. Another thing to know about stacks loading is that if any one item in the stack is loaded, the entire stack will be loaded. And this is very powerful with boss stacks, because bosses like Boom Boom, Koopalings, Bowser Jr., and Bowser, those are all inherently global entities. They never despawn by default. And so if you have a Boom Boom anywhere in the stack, then the entire stack will not despawn. So you hear that Bill Blaster keeping its drum beat going all the way very, very far. Vertical preloading also works even if one part of the stack is spawn blocked. So here I have a muncher stacked with a Boom Boom, so the muncher never despawns. This connects to a Bill Blaster, which is spawn blocked by ground, and that stack goes all the way up. So we can see that if we're all the way up here, even though the Bill Blaster in between is spawn blocked, the muncher does get loaded in early. Enemies in stacks normally have a different behavior where their movement, whatever movement they have, is overwritten by the movement of the stack. For example, that Hammer Bro can't walk and jump, that Mecha Koopa can't walk, the Magic Koopa can't teleport, because it needs to stay a part of the stack. However, they still can shoot out their projectiles while as a part of the stack. If anything, enemies on stacks normally shoot their projectiles a bit more consistently because their other movement options are not being interrupted. So here, these Hammer Bros are going to throw volleys of hammers substantially more consistently and at a more even rate than if they were allowed to walk around freely. Spikes are a little bit different. While they normally throw projectiles, they will only throw projectiles if they are at the top of a stack. Furthermore, enemies in stacks sometimes lose some of their movement options. For example, here, that Magic Koopa loses the ability to teleport. The Bowser Jr. loses his ability to ground pound. That Sledge Bro loses his ability to jump around and also ground pound. Okay? So sometimes, just by having an enemy in a stack, that will change how it moves. So before we go into individual enemies that are going to be useful, particularly useful in stacks, here I'm going to wrap up just general properties of stacks with some odds and ends. Here, enemy stacks have the same weight on a seesaw as the individual components of that stack. Stacks are immune to the grip of claws and also being carried by clouds. While you cannot make a stack with an item that is in a clown car, it is possible to have an enemy stack fall into a clown car and then stay stacked. So next, I'm going to cover applications, like specific enemies that are good for using in stacks. In general, you'll want to be familiar with the movement of various enemies in the cast that form stacks to give you a variety of different options when forming enemy stacks. However, some enemies are more generically useful in stacks than others, and here I'm going to cover which are the main highlights of enemies that you might want to keep an eye out for. The most useful enemy for stacking purposes is a Muncher, because a Muncher doesn't move and it's immune to most forms of damage and most moving shells, etc. And so you can very frequently use a Muncher stack to pin an item down and basically erase any of its movement so that you can just hit it or have it be in a specific position very reliably. For example, you will see this setup used very frequently in Team Shell levels, where it is absolutely mandatory that every single obstacle look exactly like this. In a similar vein, piranha plants, thwomps, blasters, and cannons can serve a similar role, but normally they have some other undesirable side effects that you might want to not have going on. Muncher stacks are especially useful for bosses, to keep them pinned to a specific spot in the level so that you can control exactly where their projectiles come from. Another very common way to use enemy stacks is to give protection to the enemies at the bottom of the stack. So here, for example, that Goomba is protected by a Muncher, and that Boom Boom stomping on top of him is blocked off by that Muncher as well. While this is very useful for giving bosses protection, keep in mind that with some bosses, depending on the situation, the hitbox might still allow you to hit the boss while damage boosting. Complete protection like that offered by a Muncher is not the only one you might want to use, especially in like a traditional style level. Sometimes it's sufficient to just make an enemy a little bit more interesting. So here, for example, we can have a stack of two Goombas on top of each other, which effectively has a little bit more health and more height than a standard Goomba. You can also have a spiny stack to protect the Goomba from being stomped normally, while still allowing it to be vulnerable to fireballs, shells, etc. Or give enemies like a cannon or related to defend themselves. Some enemies are intangible, like boos, bloopers, and winged buzzies, just to name a few. And so what you can do is have a stack where the enemy at the bottom of the stack controls the entire object, and then you can have some separation and keep everything on top controlled and connected to the stack all the way to the bottom. So here, for example, we can make that Boom Boom move around like a mole. Boos in particular are extremely useful for this because they are unaffected by shells, etc. So you can have all sorts of things going through them and not worry about Mario stomping on them or breaking the stack in some way. Moles are also especially useful at the bottom of the stack because they will stay in the ground. And so you can use them in a similar way to Munchers to keep something pinned down, but it's a little bit cleaner, so you can make an illusion of an enemy that just stands in place. Keep in mind that if you have multiple items in the stack, you can't make weird combinations of items come out of the ground. Only really the mole at the bottom of the stack is going to spawn in, and everything else will be despawned. So there we only had one mole in that stack come out, even though we had two moles. Mole stacks, however, will be able to tunnel out if everything in the stack above it is intangible and can just go through the ground. You can also use enemy stacks to make platforms just for Mario to move around on, and because they are tied to an enemy at the bottom of the stack and that enemy's movement, you can make it so that the platform has a unique movement that you can't normally get through like a flimsy lift or something. Your main options for this are Ching Chomp Stump, which sometimes costs a couple more entities to make. You have items that you can put on top of a Muncher, as well as a Winged Buzzy. While Winged Buzzy is the cleanest one, it also has the least clear hitbox. Keep in mind when working with stacks that it's really easy to get pinch pointed, especially with like Muncher stacks or with Chomp Stumps. I go into this more in my offset item guide, but you can use stacks to offset items. So for example here, this large Muncher can be used to center this small Muncher in a position that it can't normally be in. Also, enemies in stacks have a different vertical height depending on the specific enemy in the stack. So here, 5 Munchers piled on top of each other is taller than a stack of 5 Munchers. because the vertical height of individual enemies in the stack can be different, like they have a separately coded vertical height for stacks. And here I include an infographic by Loup&Snoop on the different heights that enemies have in stacks. Furthermore, when bombs are ignited by fire, they can no longer form a stack. And so if you put a muncher stacked on a bomb and it gets hit by a fireball, then it will immediately explode without any sort of delay. Remember that when working with enemy stacks, you're only really limited by your own imagination. There's all sorts of combinations of enemy stacks that have interesting behaviors where, sometimes you just want to pair the movement of one enemy with the protection or the sort of offense provided by a different enemy. Let's end with some examples. Here we have a Larry that rides a winged Mecha-Koopa back and forth until eventually it's broken free from the stack and then moves around the arena freely, like a normal Larry would. Here, this Iggy keeps a stack of a Fire Piranha and regular Piranha Plant on him, even after he takes damage. In this link level that I made, I use very many enemy stacks, where the bottom of the stack has an enemy that controls the movement, and it delivers a payload with a Rocky Wrench on top, which shoots projectiles. And like that, the stack in combination I can control the movement as well as the kind of hazards that are going to be put out by that obstacle. You can see Muncher stacks used very heavily in this Kaizo level to keep enemies exactly where they need to be. This freefall level uses enemy stacking to make a labyrinth of Bill Blasters. And because I have a kill all spikes clear condition in this level, whenever you replay it, the spikes in the stack don't spawn, which then changes the layout of this little labyrinth. I hope you found this guide helpful. I hope that you can use enemy stacking in a variety of different ways to make interesting, cool new setups, because enemy stacks really greatly expand the types of creative setups that you can make in your levels. If you like this guide, feel free to like and subscribe for more content like this, and I'll see you around.